Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome some new faces to the Interactive Mind Centre today, and welcome to those who are joining online as well. I'm really delighted that Patrick agreed to come over and give us a talk on his PhD project and work. I know it's of relevance to several people over here and some of the people online as well. I'm really enthusiastic about joining. Patrick has been at Aarhus for 2.5 years approximately, yeah?
Yes.
And prior to that he studied at the University of Aberdeen and St Andrews, so we have some really international experiences coming to talk to us today. So we have about 45 minutes for a talk, then we have some sandwiches coming in for those of you who are not familiar with the format here. Would you prefer questions after or as we go? Do you have any preferences?
I don't mind, but I've given time for after, but feel free to raise your hand if you like.
Yeah. For those of you who are online, if you type questions into the chat, I will get to those as well. Without further ado, Patrick, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. So, welcome everyone. Hello, and firstly, thanks so much to you for coming and for attending online, whoever is out there in the ether. Thanks to Christine for inviting me to give the talk, and here I am. And for those of you who have joined with no prior knowledge of what this talk is, my name is Patrick Cairns. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Psychology, and the talk I will give today is entitled Empathy Maps. What are they and how could they contribute to medical education? So Christine did mention it there, but my background is in the field of psychology, a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Aberdeen and a master's in health psychology from the University of St Andrews, both in Scotland. Health psychology can generally be described as the study of the psychological effects of physical health conditions, but also the study of communication within healthcare. So, hey Christopher. So it's a little intimidating for me to speak to a group of academics from a broad array of backgrounds. I'm used to talking to psychologists myself, so I don't really know what your underlying assumptions are, what methodologies you use, or even what you consider knowledge to be. But I can tell you what mine are generally, and then we can work from there. So psychology is a somewhat pragmatic discipline, so sometimes we act like a hard science and sometimes we act like a subject from the arts. So any quantitative studies that I mention come with the kind of positivist assumption that there is a single truth in the world and it can be measured in relation to my topic. And to do this we often take questionnaire data and we quantify it and use inferential statistics. So we generalize our findings from the people we give questionnaires to the broader population we're interested in. Any qualitative studies I mention will mostly have a constructivist ontology, and to me that means it comes with the assumption that multiple realities exist and people construct them through their own lived experience. To explore these realities, often we as psychologists conduct interviews and then analyze transcripts using a variety of methods, such as thematic analysis. Yes, I have never actually given a 45-minute talk before, so I have written a script and I've prepared some slides, so that's what I'll be working with today. But I wanted to start with a video and let some patients do the talking first. So I'm going to scroll this way. I'm going to skip to 31.
I mean, I wasn't even looking at her. I remember her saying, you were told that the baby would have been high risk for Downs, were you not?
She said, well, he definitely has it. He has this marker, this marker, this marker, and that's how the studies are made. And that's when my wife collapsed in the bathroom and said, how we got to the bed.
He automatically turned around and said, this is a coincidence, this has happened. And Jim says, what do you mean it's a coincidence? He said, my wife is blind and she can't see, and this is a coincidence? The way they told me was just like, they didn't really care. They didn't even think about how they're saying it.
He said, looks like you have a tumor coming out of the nose. He was in a hurry. And he just talked to me for a second, and then he walked out of the room.
She said,
I just want you to know that, this diagnosis is really good because kids like her usually die from, this type of infection. But what she doesn't realize is that she just categorized my child as a kid's like her instead of really seeing her for who she is.
He said, we told him that we are going to give him chemotherapy, but it's going to buy time because he will die very soon. The way he said it was very harmful and hurtful, actually. And I shut down. I didn't believe him.
I walked in and I was met with, well, you're a big girl, so this surgery is going to be difficult. I heard what I'd heard all my life is that you're fat. I know that it's not the way that they meant to say it, but that's what I heard. And words are all about what you hear.
So, wow, it's like psychedelic. So, what do you think was missing from those interactions that we just saw? Could it have been empathy? I feel like everyone has a sense of what empathy is, but you know as well as I that we as academics like to complicate things a bit. And the topic of empathy is one in which we can take exceptional pride in this achievement. In fact, one review on the topic found 43 definitions of empathy, and there are actually many more. I'll let her speak. So that's, 43 definitions, and then they proceeded to summarize these 43 and create their own, but this was not generally accepted, so now we have 44. But for someone whose interests are in applied science and not purely in these conceptual disagreements, what are my options? Should I defer my PhD for 10 years maybe in the hopes of some memoriam of understanding? No, I'm not going to do that. So in the field of medical education, in which I often dwell, there's a growing consensus on the definition of therapeutic empathy. That is the empathy shown by a healthcare practitioner to a patient. And the basis for this was a 1992 review of the concept of empathy by Professor Janice Morse and her colleagues. They split empathy into 4 components: emotive, moral, cognitive, and behavioural. So I'm now going to go through each of these and describe them to you. First comes the emotional component, the ability to subjectively experience and share in another's psychological state, emotions, or intrinsic feelings. Professor Morse and colleagues describe this as instinctual and automatic and describe emotional distress as contagious. This vicarious arousal is said to trigger the next component, moral empathy, described as an internal altruistic force that motivates the practice of empathy. This is the choice to either attend to and engage with another or to avoid and distance oneself from them. So it's either it's a conscious decision to either participate in another person's pain and suffering by following through with the cognitive and behavioural components, or to kind of dissociate oneself from another's plight and thereby avoid the empathic process. So if one does engage, next comes the cognitive component, which is one's intellectual ability to identify and understand another person's feelings and perspective from an objective stance. This involves imagining, comprehending, reasoning, and analysing, and therefore this component of empathy is believed to be a teachable and measurable skill built on natural abilities. And finally, we have the 4th component, behavioural, or the communicative response to convey understanding of another's perspective. This could be non-verbally through body posture or mirroring, or else through active listening, perception checking, reflection, or self-disclosure. These are concepts in psychology and maybe other disciplines. Perception checking is checking if you understand correctly by repeating it back to them. Reflection is where you summarize what they've said to them. And self-disclosure is where you reveal an anecdote which you consider similar to their experience from your own experience. All of these can be viewed by an independent observer, all of these behavioural components, and they're often graded by medical schools during OSCE examinations. OSCE exams are role plays in which a medical student must interact with an actor playing a patient and attempt to do such things such as gather a medical history. Over time, more focus was put on the final two components, cognitive and behavioural empathy within healthcare, as they were seen as easier to measure and assess, and there was also an idea that the healthcare professional should avoid over-identification with the patient and that focusing on an objective stance of cognitive empathy would help with this. From this perspective, Professor Stuart Mercer and Dr. William Reynolds in the British Journal of General Practice in 2002 described therapeutic empathy as the ability to understand the patient's situation, perspective and feelings, communicate that understanding and check its accuracy, and to act on that understanding with the patient in a helpful or therapeutic way. So in a field looking for certainty, there's a growing consensus that this is the definition of therapeutic empathy. Understanding the patient, communicating that understanding, and acting upon it in a therapeutic way. So now I will attempt to cover some of the more frequently asked questions related to therapeutic empathy in the hope of clearing up some confusions that people often have. So it's not expected that a healthcare practitioner, or anyone for that matter, will achieve complete empathy, that is, to understand exactly another person's emotional or cognitive state. However, healthcare practitioners often interact with near universal human conditions and experience such as pain, loss, suffering and healing, which most can empathize with to varying degrees, and often this can be enough. Some also say that empathy is a bad idea because you just burn out and you can't do it anymore. So the idea goes that you experience kind of personal distress at another person's suffering, and over time this response leads to burnout. Burnout, just to cover that quickly, is described as a mixture of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization of those around you, and a loss of sense of personal accomplishment. In response to this, firstly, I would say that personal distress is not always an empathic response, and one may be mislabeling one's own anxiety at witnessing pain and suffering as empathy, when the patient is not always experiencing those emotions themselves. But that's just one perspective from myself. What about, what does the evidence say in the literature? Well, Dr. Helen Wilkinson and colleagues searched the literature in 2016 to look for cross-sectional studies that examined the link between empathy in doctors and burnout. They found 10 relevant studies, and the overall finding was that empathy was actually negatively associated with burnout. Therefore, when empathy levels were high, burnout was low. When burnout was high, empathy was low. The authors of this study are quick to point out that this obviously does not mean that empathy reduces burnout, but simply that the two are correlated. Furthermore, there wasn't a kind of meta-analysis done, so the effects were simply narratively reported. But what about if we ask doctors directly, what causes you to burn out? Can anyone here guess what doctors say when they're asked the question, what causes you to burn out? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Eva?
Well, high workload and annoying or mad patients would be my guess.
Traffic.
Yes? Louise?
Well, connected to that, maybe not having the time to engage and have empathy to be able to help the patients.
Aha. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Organizational demands, like documentation demands, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And are also not connected to the patient interaction.
Yes, absolutely. Cool. On the back?
Social intrigues within the stuff.
Aha. That's another interesting one, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, was that social?
Intrigues within the staff. Brilliant points. And the answer from that study was workload. So a 2022 review looking at 141 studies concluded that longer working hours, more shifts per month, and being on call were consistent predictors of burnout, and empathy was not mentioned by the doctors. There was another study that I didn't mention that mentioned the electronic, where you have to write down all your notes. Journal. This was a major bother for people and caused them a lot of burnout as well, so something you mentioned. So what else is therapeutic empathy associated with? Quite a lot, actually. The ability of physicians to display empathy has been positively associated with several outcomes of patient care in a series of systematic reviews. So firstly, studies suggest empathy is associated with improved treatment outcomes for patients, both physical and psychological, by reducing pain and anxiety. And secondly, empathy has been found to increase patient adherence to treatments via the growth of interpersonal trust and a sense of partnership between the doctor and the patient. And thirdly, there is a positive correlation between empathy and patient satisfaction, primarily through the lowering of anxiety and distress. So either through direct therapeutic effects or indirectly through the expectation effect, therapeutic empathy appears to be associated with some pretty positive things. So moving specifically to doctors now, how are their therapeutic empathy levels? Well, I would say personally suboptimal. So let me explain that wording. So bringing another academic in, Professor Jeremy Howick and colleagues pooled the results of 64 studies involving over 23,000 patients in 2017, and using a patient-rated empathy scale which asks patients to rate their physician's empathy. Medical students and physicians had the lowest average empathy scores compared to all other healthcare practitioners. And in a scale of about 50, because it was quantified, there was about a 6-point difference. So they are rated by patients as having the lowest empathy. There are, of course, caveats to this, such as these were very statistically significant difference scores, but there are things such as minimum clinically important difference values, which are about how far do you need to go on a scale before it's noticeable in a clinic. This has not been done yet for the scale, so I can't say anything definitively about that. But it does at least point to a clear statistical difference between these healthcare workers. And further evidence has suggested that medical students' empathy may actually decline as they progress through medical school, from the first year of their study to their last. And suggested reasons for this are a high volume of material to learn, time pressures, and a focus on the biomedical model of health and illness, where people are treated as bodily systems and diseased organs as opposed to full human beings. I should point out, of course, that these technical skills are essential to working as a doctor, and thank God that they're there and we're able to use them as part of a healthy society. And I'm very grateful personally that these skills are here and they know them. But maybe there's more to medical education beyond that. So I ask you, if empathy is associated with improved treatment outcomes, and the current medical curriculum reduces empathy possibly, might it be helpful to add something to the medical curriculum that promotes people-centered healthcare? It begs the question, can empathy be taught? And controversy may exist as to whether empathy is teachable or whether one is just born with a certain level which one retains throughout life. This controversy may stem from the confusion around whether empathy is a behavior, personality dimension, or an experienced emotion. And this is where leaning on the definition of therapeutic empathy, which I did earlier, makes things a little less controversial, because it's a bit less about the capacity for feeling and more about understanding and using this understanding, which makes it more teachable. empathy interventions in healthcare do actually already exist, and 26 trials have been published, which meta-analysis suggests has an overall moderate effect on patient empathy after they've taken part in these interventions. So to me, that indicates that empathy can actually be taught, at least temporarily. So what actually exists in the medical curriculum that could be empathy focused? Well, the Calgary-Cambridge Guide to the Medical Interview is widely used in medical schools, and it informs the kind of core components of most undergraduate medical education communications curriculums, as Eva will be well aware. She teaches medical students. The guide splits the consultation into 4 sequential stages, so initiating the consultation, gathering information, explanation and planning, and then closing the consultation. And there are kind of 2 parallel tasks that run through these, which are building the relationship and providing structure, which sounds promising. It also contains 11 skills and 71 micro skills for the doctor. And the 5th skill, developing rapport, contains a micro skill called empathy and support. This is the only mention of empathy within the Calgary-Cambridge model. So I think that it does promote communication skills, but it doesn't necessarily think about it in terms of empathy. And a Delphi study regarding the content of Danish undergraduate medical curriculum did not mention training empathy, but does mention reflection about empathy skills within the category personal characteristics and skills of the student. This kind of implies to me that perhaps there's a belief that among these stakeholders that it is not important to conduct empathy training within the undergraduate medical curriculum, or that it is not possible. It is more about reflection about what you already have. So there are further studies that I have left out for brevity's sake, but I will say from this incomplete picture, it appears that empathy as a theme is present in communication curriculums to varying degrees, but the topic is not directly addressed, and the concept of empathy training is usually not present. So, broadly speaking, the medical curriculum is primarily about technical skills and knowledge. But a 2021 poll by a large consulting firm of 1,700 recent US patients asked which factors were most important to creating a positive experience within healthcare. Top with 55% was a medical provider who explains the patient's content and treatment clearly, which I would describe as a mix of technical and communication skills. The second one, with 52%, because they were able to choose multiple, was a provider who listens, understands patients' needs, and involves emotional support. So, if the medical curriculum is here on technical skills and here on communication, but what patients want is technical skills and communication, then things are not matching. The patient's desires does not match the reality that they face in the healthcare system. So to summarize what I've said so far, I've provided a background for the definition of therapeutic empathy, which is to understand the patient, communicate that understanding, and act upon it in a therapeutic way. And using systematic reviews and meta-analyses, I've then argued that therapeutic empathy is positive for doctors and patients, but that current levels are suboptimal. And I have then attempted to show that empathy training is not really present in medical school curriculum, communications curriculums. So now I will discuss something that could be implemented into medical educations very easily to address this, and that is an empathy map, which you have on your desk, and you can see on the screen if you're watching online. So an empathy map is a tool that assists in understanding another's perspective, and was originally created in business to develop customer profiles. It was described in the book Game Storming, a playbook for innovators, rule breakers, and change makers, which sounds Awful. And that was done in 2010 by Dave Gray, Sunny Brown and James McGanufo, and this was described as a game. The goal of the game was to gain a deeper level of understanding of a stakeholder in your business ecosystem, which may be a client, prospect or partner. So it'll be done in a given context, such as a buying decision or an experience using a product or service. The empathy map synthesizes information that you know about an individual through the visualization and asking of questions of what they say, do, hear and see. 4 further sections include what causes them major worries, what makes them happy, what are their fears and frustrations, and what do they want and need. Those wishing to understand another's perspective complete the empathy map from the perspective of that individual. So it's really interesting for me to consider that this is the world that empathy maps came from, given that the bottom line for businesses are primarily monetary profit, whereas the bottom line for healthcare, in my opinion, should be the health of the patient. So by asking what an individual says, does, sees and hears, the top 4 you see before you, this kind of engages with the person's sensed, lived experience of that individual. And the remaining 4 sections engage with the individual's cognitive and emotional world. And in my opinion, empathy maps therefore have the potential to aid medical students in understanding the patient, which is the first component of therapeutic empathy. I should say at this stage that I was not the one who first introduced the idea of using them in medical education. That was Dr. Anita Laidlaw and Dr. Evelyn Watson, who are both active in the field of medical education in Scotland. So I stand on the shoulders of these giants. So what research has been done regarding empathy maps in medical education so far? Very little. So in 2019, myself and colleagues at the University of St Andrews conducted a qualitative study exploring their use. In this study, first-year medical students and volunteer patients had a 1-hour open-ended conversation about what it was like to live with a chronic complex condition, their experiences in the health service and their definitions of health. This was followed by the medical students completing the empathy map as if they were the person they had just spoken to, and the patient partner filled in the map from their own perspective. The medical students were then able to look at the maps and see what was different and what was similar. What did they have completely off and what were they similar to? Often it's a case of priorities, so they have similar ideas but they're different on the list. And I'll go into some examples a bit later on. So I interviewed 16 of these students and 12 of the patients after completing this exercise. And I analysed the interviews using thematic analysis, and in these interviews I asked patients about the experience of using the conversation and of using the empathy map. So what did we find? Well, we developed 3 main themes from this analysis, which were that students perceived value in the empathy map because it provided a kind of structure to their ideas of empathy. Often they describe empathy as this generalized feeling that they're not really able to put into words or do much about beyond just try to act helpfully, whereas this was a really structured way of saying, here's what I know about you and here's what I understand. It also was a platform for the consideration of the patient's life world in a collaborative way, because the students filled it out together and had to discuss, and they discovered sometimes not only was maybe their idea different to the patient's, their idea was different to the medical student who was sitting beside them, and this was a kind of learning moment as well for them. And it was just a basis to talk to a patient. They were in their first year of their medical school. They don't often get an opportunity to speak to a patient for an hour, and maybe they never will again. So this is an opportunity to really delve deep while they can. Medical school is a learning opportunity. Are doctors going to be able to use an empathy map in every GP appointment they have? No. So this is a moment to teach this way of thinking while they're in that learning environment. So it also impacted on their perceptions of the empathy and the doctor-patient relationship. They discussed how empathy could lead to more trusting interactions and therefore more accurate, personalised diagnoses. And they had ideas how to improve the sessions, such as defining the context of the map. So what do they hear in this context as opposed to what do they hear in life? So what do they hear from their doctor in the healthcare service as opposed to what do they hear from all of them around them? And finally, they wanted a few more sessions. It felt a bit ephemeral. They do this once with a patient and then they never interact with an empathy map again. It's hard to kind of solidify any learning that might occur. So we did publish this. It was a 4-page paper with a limited room for elaboration in a small journal called The Clinical Teacher. But it got the idea of using empathy maps in medical education out there for the first time. We're not claiming effectiveness in changing empathy levels or any such thing. We're just describing the experiences and ideas of our students and patients had in those sessions. So I'm going to do a little personal exercise in this map with you guys to kind of give you a sense of what it's like to fill it in. So I want you to go back to post-Brexit Scotland, which you can all imagine very easily. It's 2019. I'm in my late 20s and I'm working part-time as a research assistant and full-time in a cocktail bar in a hotel. And the pay was awful. The hours were long and late, and the customers could maybe have done with an empathy map or two. So, and don't get me started on the bar job. No, I'm just kidding. So I had about £200 or maybe 1,800 kroner in my bank account after bills, and the research jobs were small and far between. So I ask you, dear attentive audience, like the question on the empathy map, I want you to consider what were my fears and frustrations at that point. So I want you to spend a minute alone or together, whatever you like. Just try and consider what my fears and frustrations at that point might have been. All right, that's all you got because there's quite a lot, not so much time. No more empathy. So would anyone like to hazard a guess or put it out, something out there?
Losing your job.
Losing my job, yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And losing the opportunity to focus on your research and interests because you had to, spend too much time on the bar job.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points.
Work-life balance.
Absolutely.
Poverty?
Yeah, I was below the poverty line at that point in my life. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously had a lot of, if I had needed to, I suppose I could have gone to my parents and things. So I can't pretend that I'm this really totally, I'm not as hard done by as other people in society at that point. But yes, I was worried about running out of money. So I'm going to go, so what my fears and frustrations were not being able to pay rent, running out of money, staying in a negative work environment for little pay, and I had invested in this path and going to university and stuff, and it didn't appear to be going too far. So there's some fears and frustrations I had. So let's do one more of these. My girlfriend was finishing off her PhD at the time, and she wanted to move to Denmark to collaborate with Conor Moore in the psychology department. And I had these fears and frustrations with my life and with life in the UK, so I decided to apply for a PhD here in Aarhus, and on the second attempt I got it, and we travelled to Denmark, and we arrive on the 2nd of January 2021. It's it's winter, it was a COVID lockdown,
Go.
So I ask you to consider my life again, except what do you think I heard from those around me? What do you think I saw? What do you think I was doing? Just take a minute to imagine my lived experience and what was happening to me. Right, well, I'm noticing the time, so I'm not actually going to ask you guys, sorry. But I was hearing not much. I got some confused emails about COVID, but the rules weren't really in place, so I was just kind of winging it in this tiny house near Brabant. And I was seeing a lot of frost and ice and some spent fireworks from on the roads, and not so many people in the streets. And I met my supervisor after 3 months. I cycled to the department, but I wasn't allowed in the building because of COVID. So, you know, this isn't all per me moment. This is just a way for you to kind of get inside my head and use the empathy map practically. But I haven't asked any of the patients in our studies so far if they can share their maps, or if I can share their maps, so I can't share one totally, but I can share one anonymous example. So if we consider Claire, the question was about seeing. What does this person see around them? And the individual students were talking to someone who was in a wheelchair. And the students had spent some time on the question, gradually getting more and more abstract. They spoke about seeing other people, noticing their wheelchair, which were not bad points at all and had come up in the conversation for sure. But in the end, the patient wrote one word, just one word, which was stairs.
Yeah.
And to me, that's insightful. And, you know, perhaps if they had not filled in this empathy map, they would never get to this kind of granular level of detail about lived experience, where they would really find this out and notice that this person has a lot of barriers around them at all times. And even just existing in a building is challenging for that person. So I'm hoping to illustrate to you the type of mindset that these kind of focus questions create. And it's not all about getting it right. It's about creating the mindset that considers the person more fully. But if I then go on quickly, so what was my PhD about? So originally it had 3 components. It was going to be a pilot study for a randomized control trial, a randomized control trial, and a process evaluation. Basically, the main point was to assess the effectiveness of the empathy map training in increasing medical student empathy levels. Does it actually change empathy? So the pilot study was conducted with voluntary communications classes within the medical school curriculum. So although around 70 of the students were scheduled to attend to the voluntary classes, in the end a total of 19 students took part in my pilot study, which is actually not that bad a number for a pilot study. And in it I tested a standardized protocol for conducting empathy map training, as well as looking at likely evaluation tools for an RCT. So what did I actually learn in the study? So much, actually. Firstly, the protocol itself worked, so the students were able to navigate between the different parts of the training without problems or complaints. It was smooth, and this is the first time that a standardized protocol has been used or described in empathy map training in healthcare. As I say, these are very early days for it, so everything is new basically. The outcome measures were of particular interest to me actually, because I had rather blindly used a certain scale, a self-report scale of empathy. And when I looked later on at the before and after scores, they were nearly identical, almost impressively so. And I had initially worried about this. I thought, okay, so it doesn't work, it's full of null effects, so that's the end of that. But of course, we can't make effectiveness judgments based on the study of 19 people. If you want to make a clear statement on the effectiveness of something, then you need to do a properly powered randomized control trial, which involves a control group, enough students in each group to make a definitive statement using statistics. So despite there not being enough power to make these judgments, does it mean that the empathy map training is just a null effect? A colleague of mine actually, Dr. Renee Lim, MD from the medical school at the University of Sydney, pointed something out to me. If I'm imagining empathy maps to possibly alter a way of thinking, i.e. cognitive empathy, then I shouldn't really use a global empathy scale that was not based on Mercer's definition. It's a classic case of not actually measuring what I wanted to measure, a validity issue. And secondly, if I want to alter a way of thinking, am I really expecting things to change just immediately, like 5 minutes after an intervention? This would supposedly take time, perhaps need multiple exposures, and need follow-ups measures in the scale of months and not minutes. And I also asked students to do a kind of 5-minute history-taking exercise with a simulated patient after they had done this. And these are really granular details I'm mentioning now, so there were points of this scale that measured things that I wasn't assessing, such as whether the student made a plan. And this meant that the students received artificially low scores because they didn't make a plan, so they were rated 0 on that point. So these are another small point that I have to consider for an RCT and things like this. And another point I have to consider is if I'm creating a tool that I theoretically believe will alter cognitive empathy, not behavioural empathy, can I expect it to be measurable by others? And this also got me thinking about what I actually was hoping to change and the validity of the instruments I had chosen. So all in all, it was a great sandbox for me to learn and prepare for a larger scale trial, which is exactly what a pilot should be, I suppose. And I also found at least one way of running the map which runs smoothly. But as you're aware, PhDs do not always go to plan, and it was in trying to prepare for an RCT I had to come to some hard truths. To do an RCT you need a lot of commitment and investment from relevant stakeholders, including the medical school, people organising the communications course, a steady source of volunteer patients. And long story short, I ended up with none of these. And around mid-2022, I had to come to the conclusion that it was just not going to happen. And this took some time to get my head around and think about and what else was possible. I think I started at 5 past, so maybe I'll just go to 10 to 8.
Another 5
Yeah. But at the same time, I had realised from my pilot study that there was a lot to explore with empathy maps before ever getting to a large, well-powered RCT. So, reality and discovery combined to mean that I did not actually do what I originally planned in my RCT. So I put the RCT to rest and set upon finding something new. I had done a series of interviews with students in Scotland and England regarding the empathy map, and I had interviewed a number of them at 3 time points, 1 week prior to it, 1 week after, and 2 months after. And this was an interesting opportunity to do a kind of longitudinal qualitative analysis of what had been happening in their minds. This could provide some really interesting findings regarding changes in thinking regarding the empathy map. I had never gotten a chance to analyse this because the project ran out of money. And with my supervisor's permission, I decided the analysis of this data would be the second part of my work. I'm doing this currently. I'm currently analysing this data with colleagues at the University of St Andrews and the University of Leicester. One main topic of interest is the process of how students learn when taking part in empathy map training. We're interested in incorporating learning theory, including components of cognitive learning theory and experiential learning, but also Mesiro's transformative learning theory, in which learners experience a disorientating dilemma, which is the catalyst to review one's own perspective. This may relate to work being done in Copenhagen, in fact, on medical students feeling touched and shaken by interacting with patients with chronic conditions in communications training, which they describe may act as an ignition for further empathy. Furthermore, Dr. Wild and colleagues from the University of Southern Denmark have done some really interesting work on empathy as a learning objective, and I'm hoping to incorporate their understanding into my work once I actually understand their work. And finally, for the final piece of research I will conduct, I'm going to travel to Australia to work with Professor Francis Boyle and Dr. Renee Lim, MD, at the medical school at the University of Sydney. In fact, I leave in about 2 weeks for 3 months, so exciting. Behavioural interventions such as the empathy map are complex, and their development should be supported by the use of theory as recommended by the UK General Medical Council. As part of this project, we will characterise key mechanisms of the empathy map training which contribute to its success or failure using the behaviour change wheel as originally created by Professor Susan Mickey and colleagues. Briefly, the wheel was developed from many frameworks of behaviour change theory, and it consists of 3 layers. The centre is the column B model. And the idea for that is that for someone to change their behaviour, they must have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to do so. And once you have decided which of these are relevant to your behaviour change model, you'll move to the second layer, which involves intervention functions. For example, if opportunity here was important in what you're trying to change, such as reducing the opportunity to buy cigarettes or increasing the access to green spaces, then the 2 intervention functions of restriction and environmental restructuring would be important here. So you would maybe restrict the access to buying cigarettes or raise the price, and you would maybe increase the access to green spaces. So as part of this, and finally the other layer is about particular policy measures which could be used on an organisational and governmental level, and should any desired behaviour change be supported on a systemic level. I've really run through this, but we're aiming to test the implementation of empathy maps in medical schools, asking questions such as applicability, practicality, effectiveness, acceptability, side effects, and equity. So we're asking all types of questions such as, are there any good or negative side effects to using the empathy map? Does it increase or decrease health inequalities in the system? And these types of questions. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it online, and we're going to do over 30 minutes and do it 4 times over the course of a month. So it's going to be more longitudinal than last time. And we're going to have a control condition that is a wait list. Of course, this isn't a fully powered trial as well, so we can't make statements about efficacy, but we can answer the questions that I just brought up there about applicability and such like. So further research could look at an RCT examining the effectiveness of the map, its use in other caring or interpersonal jobs, interprofessional communication, how to optimize the empathy map, the use of real or simulated patients, whether students compare the map with a patient or not. There's just so many possible questions and further things you could do with it. But how could you guys fit into this? What are your areas of expertise, and what do you know that could contribute positively to the empathy map if you think it's a good idea? Maybe it's a way of viewing things from a sociological level. Maybe it's a really cool statistical technique for an RCT, such as I don't know how to do multi-level linear modeling, but if you did an RCT in multiple medical schools, and then you did it in groups, so there were different groups in each medical school, then there seems to be some important levels there that a MLM would be useful for. But that's for you to consider. So finally, I have 3 points from this talk that I'd like you to take home. That is that therapeutic empathy is a healthcare worker's ability to understand the patient, communicate that understanding, and act upon it in a shared and therapeutic way. The second is that empathy is associated with a range of positive outcomes for doctors and patients, from reduced burnout to improved treatment outcomes for patients, both psychological and physical. And finally, my PhD has provided a standardized protocol for empathy map training so far, which others can follow, either in research or in medical training. It continues to explore how students learn when doing an empathy map, and it continues to explore the theoretical underpinning of the map from a behavior change perspective, including assessing applicability, practicality, cost effectiveness, acceptability, side effects, and equity. I would like to finish just with a 2-minute bit to let the patients finish, do the talking and not me. So I will just... Okay.
Second surgeon, It was never even brought up. And the doctor also leaned in and said, don't worry about this. We're going to take care of this, and I'm staying with you the whole time. He didn't care what my scale said.
I remember the surgeon leaning over me right before I went under, and he said, I am going to take very good care of you. And it was that one human connection, when I looked into his eyes, that I finally went, oh, okay.
She was talking with me, not at me, and she was asking me, tell me about your mom. And I realized that she was doing that so that the type of interaction that she was going to have with my mom, she could make it real.
He was real gentle. He said, you have AML, leukemia. And that's when I started to cry, and I said, okay. He hugged me, and, oh, yeah. And that put me at ease.
And I walked out of his office after a very good appointment, and he walked one direction in the hallway and I walked the other with my wife. And he turned around and he called my name, and he said, Mr. Schmidt. And I turned around and we were probably 20 feet apart. And he said, I just want you to know you're doing very well. So I think when you see a doctor that cares that much, it kind of makes you feel good.
The most powerful and impactful words that I heard, they educated me and empowered me. I was able to make an informed decision and actually spend quality time with my mom. At the end of her life.
Thank you.